So, for better or worse, by the end of August, the townspeople could be taken to the last resting place. If not decently, at least good enough for the authorities to feel that they were carrying out their duties with a clear conscience. We might jump a little ahead of events to note that the steps that had finally to be taken when the epidemic leveled out after August, the accumulated number of victims was far greater than the capacity for our little cemetery. It was all very well knocking down walls and giving the dead an outlet into their surrounding land, but something else had to be done, and soon. First of all, they decided to bury the dead at night, which simply allowed them to do without certain forms of ceremonies. More and more bodies could be pulled up in the ambulances, and few late strollers who, against all the rules, were still wandering around in the outlying districts after curfew, or those who had to go there for work, sometimes came across a long white ambulance which drove past at full speed, making the hollow nighttime streets echo with their dull sirens. The bodies were hastily thrown into the pits. They were buried, rarely come to rest before the spitful of quicklime was laying on their faces and the anonymous earth covered in the holes, and they were being dug even more deep. However, after a short time, they were obligated to go and look elsewhere and gain more space. The deep-seer of the prefect explorated the occupants from the graves and leased the propriety and all the realms, dug up and was sent off to the crematorium. Soon it was necessary to take those who had died of the plague off for cremation, but for this they had to use the old incinerating oven on the east of town outside the gates. The guard's post was moved further out of town. All employees made the task of the authorities much easier by advising them that the timeline which the formality served in the seaside predominated was now being laying idle. To the end, they made the authorities to the interior of the trucks and the engines by taking out the seats and redirected the tracks of the oven, and now became the end of the line. In the middle of the night, through the hole in the rest of the summer and beneath the autumn rain, one could see the strange convoys of trams without passengers proceeding down the front, rattling along above the sea. Eventually the people discovered what was going on, and despite patrols preventing anyone from reaching the prodome, some groups did quite often manage to get among the rocks right above the sea, throwing flowers at the carriages, and the trams went past. One could hear the vehicles still bumping along the summer night, laden with flowers and corpses. By morning, at least in the early days, a thick, foul-smelling vapor would be drifting through the eastern quarter of town. All the doctors were of the opinion that these emissions, though unpleasant, could not harm anyone, but the inhabitants of the district immediately threatened to evacuate them. Convinced that the plague would rain down on their heads from the sky, so much of the authorities were forced to redirect the fumes, which means for the complicated system of piping. The inhabitants were pacified. Only on very windy days would a vague smell of the east remain them that they were living under a new order, and that the flames of the plague devoured their sacrifice every evening. These were the extreme consequences of the epidemic. Fortunately, it did not increase any further, because one might imagine that the integrity of the administration and the talents of the prefect, and even the capacity of the oven, might have been overwhelmed. Ryu knew that in the case desperate measures had to be envisioned. For example, throwing bodies into the sea He could easily picture this monstrous form of blue wave. He also knew that if the figures went on rising, no organization, however excellent, could withstand it, and that the men would come to die in heaps and rot away in the streets. Despite the prefect, and the town would see that the dead in the public square clinging to living in the mixture of justified hatred and ridiculous hope. It was this kind of evidence, or fear, which meant that the following citizens had to continually feel the exile and separation. At the junction, the narrator is perfectly well aware how unfortunate it is that he cannot here describe something truly spectacular. For example, some reassuring hero or some impulsive action similar to those that one finds in old stories, and the trouble is that there is nothing less spectacular than the pestilence, and if only because it lasts so long and great misfortune are monstrous. In the memory of those who have lived through them in the dreadful days of the plague, do not seem like the vast flames cruel and magnificent, but rather like the endless trampling of the flattered everything in its path. No, the plague had nothing in common with the great elevating images of the oppressed Dr. Ryu had at the start of the epidemic. First of all, it was truly designed in a flawless system, which operated with great efficiency. Incidentally, not to give anything away, and especially not to give himself away, this is why the narrator tends towards objectivity. He is tried to change almost nothing in the artistic end, except when it came to the basic requirements of giving a more or less coherent account. And it is objectively why he requires him to say here that while the greatest suffering of the time, the most widespread and deepest, was separation. While it is necessary in the consequence to give new description of it at this point of the plague, it is also quite true that even these sufferings lost all its pathos. Did our fellow citizens, at least those who were suffered the most from this separation, ever get used to the situation? It was not be quite correct to say that they did. Rather, they suffered a kind of spiritual and physical implication. At the start of the plague, they remembered those persons whom they had lost very well, and they were sorry to be without them. But though they could clearly recall the face and laugh of the loved ones this or that day, when after the event they realized they had been happy, they found it very hard to imagine what the other person might be doing at the moment when they recall him or her in places where now were far away. In short, at the time, they had memories but not enough imagination. At the second stage of the plague, the memories also went. Not that they had forgotten the face, but which comes in the same thing. It had lost the flesh, they could only see it inside themselves. And while it was early week, and they tended to complain at only having shadows to deal with, where their loved ones were concerned, they realized later that these shadows could become still more fleshless, losing even details of color in the memory that kept them. After this long period of separation, they could no longer imagine the intimacy that they had shared, nor a being had lived beside them, on whom at any moment they could place their hands. From this point of view, they had entered into a very system of, among the experience, the great feeling anymore. From anyone had benign feeling. It was time to it ended, they said, because of the period of pestilence, and it's normal to wish the end of the collective suffering, and because they really did want it to end. But the words were spoken without anger or bitterness in the early days, and only with a few arguments that still remain clear to us, which were feeble ones. The great fierce surge of feeling on the first weeks had given way to dejection, and it would be wrong to confuse with recognition, but which was despite what kind of provisional assent. The townspeople had adapted, and they had come to heal. These people say because they were all they could do now. Naturally, they still had the attitude of misfortune and suffering. But they did not feel the sting. Dr. Yu, for one, considered that the misfortune lay precisely in this, and that the habit of despair was worse than the despair itself. Previously, those separated had not really been unhappy, but the suffering had the brightness that had just gone out. Now one could see them in the corner of the streets, in the cafes, or in their friends, placid in their mind, wandering, and their eyes so bored that, thanks to them, the whole town seemed like a waiting room. Those who had jobs did them at the pace of the plague, masterfully and psychotically. Everyone had simple and unprecedented, for the first time in the separated, did not mind speaking about their absent ones, adopting the language of all and studying the separation, just as they would study the statistics of the epidemic. Well, up to this point, they had fiercely subtracted their suffering from the sum of the collective misfortune. Now they had accepted it as part of the whole. Without the memory, without the hope, they settled into the present, into the truth. Everything became the present to them. The truth must be told. The plague had taken away from them all the power of love and even the friendship, and the love demands some future. And for us, this was the only here and now. Of course, none of this was absolute. Though it is true that all the separated reached this point, one should add also that they did not reach it at the same time, and that once they had settled into the new attitudes and the flashes of memory suddenly replaced in lucidity, brought the sufferers back to a younger, more painful substability, and that they needed these memories loses in the concentration in which they had plans for something that implied that the plague might have ceased. They needed the unexpected boon of feeling and the pangs of the indirect jealousy. Others also experienced the sudden revivals that would emerge from the torpors of the certain days of the week. On Sunday, of course, the Saturdays afternoons, because those days had devoted to certain rituals when they were still with the absent ones, or others at certain melancholy that took hold of them at the end of the day, would give warning, not always correct as it happened. The memory was about to return that time in the evening which, for believers, is the occasion for experimentation and the consequences. It heard from the prisoner on the exile who had only the void to examine. It held them at the moment of substance, and they returned to the instability and locked themselves up in the plague. It was already understood that this conscious of giving up what was most personal to them, while in the early days of the plague they were snuck by the numbers of small things and the great deal of them, though they had no significance to other. They thus had a limited outlook on life. Now, in the contrary, they were the ones most general ideas, and their love itself had taken the most abstract appearance for them. They were far from abandoned to the plague, and that they might sometimes even for nothing more than sleep a plague and catch themselves thinking, "Let's have the barbos and be done with it." But the truth that they already sleeping, and the whole time there was nothing more than a long sleep. The town was inhabited by people asleep on their feet, and they did not really escape from the fate except on the rare occasion when the night on their apparently healed wounds would suddenly open. Then, walking without a start, they would feel around in this kind of stupor, the lids smarting in the stroke, and they would discover the pain which had suddenly revived, and with the devastated features of their love, In the morning they would return to the pestilence, and they would say to routine. But when they did look like the separate people, you ask, well, the answer is simple, like nothing, or if you prefer, they look like everyone in the part of the general scene. They share the felicity and the puerile agitation of the town. They lost the appearance of critical sense, and they were retaining the appearance of snug fortitude. For example, you could see the most intelligent among the pretending in search for the newspaper or the radio broadcast for the reason they believed that the plague would shortly end. And apparently they built the imagery of hope and felt unfounded terrors. On reading the views from some journalists, they sat down more or less by chance and yawning with boredom. Otherwise, they drank from the beer or looked after the sick, lazy and exhausted themselves. They filled cards or they played gramophone records and otherwise distinguishing themselves from others. In other words, they no longer made choice of the plague and suppressed their value judgments. This could be seen as the way that no one cared for longer than the quality of the clothes or the food they bought. Everything was accepted as it came. Finally, one might say that the separated no longer had a particular privilege that they protected from the start. They had the lost egotism of love and the bandage and the gain by it. At least now the situation was clear and the pestilence affected everybody. All of us, in the midst of the shown, could be heard in the gates of the town, and the thump of the rubber stamps, and the beat of the rhythm of lives, and our deaths in the midst of the fires and the filling cars, terror and the formalities, destined for an ignorism, and registered death and the horrifying smoke that was tranquil notes, the ambulance, and the same bread of exile waiting, though we did not know it, for the devastating reunion that was devastating peace. No doubt our love was still there, and the quiet simply was unusable, heavy to carry, inert inside us, sterile at crime and contamination, and was no longer anything except a pestilence with no features in the stubborn way. From this point of view, the attitude was the same as our fellow citizens. Remained one of those that queued in all parts of the town in front of the food shops. There were the same registration and the same forbiddance, and once limitless without illusion, it was merely that they were separated with the concern. The feeling had to be measured on a scale 1,000 times greater because of the kind of hunger that was involved. One might devour everything. In any case, should anyone wish to have the current notion of the state of mind in the separated of the town, one must also describe the eternal golden dusty evenings which descended on the treeless town, while men and women poured into every street, because oddly those rose at such times towards the still sunlit traces in the absence of sound and the beclosed machinery and usually made up the language of the town. It was vast noise, the footsteps, muffled voices, painful groans, thousands of shoes marching the rhythm of the pestilent in the heavy sky, and the endless evening stifling thumble which gradually filled the whole town, with which evening after evening the most faithful and the most melancholy expression of blind obstinacy which at the time replaced love in our hearts.